Picture a winter morning where the air hurts to breathe, where your front door doesn't open, not because it's locked, but because the cold has fused it shut, where the fire you lit before bed has burned down to embers, and the room is so cold your breath hangs in front of your face like smoke. Somewhere outside a train whistle should sound, but doesn't. It hasn't for days. This was Canada in 1933. Families woke up not knowing if coal would arrive, not knowing if food would last, not knowing if help was coming at all. The cold didn't strike in a single night. It settled in, day after day, tightening its grip until normal life simply stopped working. Children slept fully dressed, furniture disappeared into stoves, livestock froze where they stood. Towns waited in silence, cut off from the country they were supposed to be part of. There were no warnings, no breaking news, no dramatic moment you could point to and say, "That's when it happened." Just a slow, terrifying realization spreading across the country. This winter wasn't passing through, it was staying. And Canada was about to learn how close a modern society can come to breaking, not from panic, but from endurance. In the early weeks of winter, nothing felt unusual. Across the vast interior of Canada, families moved through the season the way they always had. Fires were lit before dawn, boots were left by doors to dry, children pulled on stiff wool coats and scarves and stepped into the dark, crunching snow underfoot as they walked to school. On farms, men rose early to break ice on water troughs and check livestock before the light came up. In towns, shopkeepers brushed snow from sidewalks, unlocked doors, and waited for customers who might come or might not. It was winter. Hard, yes. Cold, certainly, but familiar. This was 1933. The country was already strained. The Great Depression had settled over North America like a heavy fog. Money was scarce. Work was unreliable. Families lived close to the edge, stretching meals, repairing what could no longer be replaced, and learning how to do without. There were no safety nets waiting quietly in the background, no emergency deliveries on standby. What you had on hand was what you would rely on, and still, winter itself wasn't feared. Not yet. Canada was built with cold in mind. Houses were small but solid. Wood stoves and coal furnaces sat at the heart of most homes, radiating heat into a single room where families gathered at night. Bedrooms were colder, kitchens colder still, but that was normal. You wore extra layers, you slept under heavy blankets, you accepted discomfort as part of the season. Railways were the lifeline. Coal, food, mail, medicine, everything moved by train. As long as the rails ran, life continued. As long as deliveries came, towns functioned. People trusted that system without thinking about it, the way people trust gravity or daylight. The first cold fronts arrived quietly. Temperatures dipped lower than average, but no one panicked. Weather reports were brief, often vague. Forecasting was limited. You didn't check a screen for what was coming. You felt it in the air, in the stiffness of your fingers, in the way your breath clouded more thickly than usual. Then the cold stayed. January passed, and the thaw everyone expected never came. Snow hardened instead of melting. Ice thickened on rivers and lakes. Frost crept deeper into the ground, locking soil and pipes into place. In some areas, wells began to freeze, doors warped, window panes cracked under the pressure of the cold. Still, people assumed it would break. Winters always did. But as February approached, something shifted. Temperatures dropped further, not for a night, not for a weekend, but day after day. The kind of cold that stopped being a number on a thermometer and became a physical presence. Metal burned to the touch. Leather stiffened like wood, oil thickened, machinery resisted movement, as if the world itself was slowing down. Rail crews began reporting trouble. Switches froze, brakes failed, snow packed into places it shouldn't have been able to reach. Trains ran late, then slower, then not at all. Lines that had operated through decades of winter suddenly stalled, not from a single storm, but from accumulation, cold layered on cold, ice reinforced by more ice. On farms, the problem wasn't snow, it was depth. Drifts piled high enough to swallow fences, roads disappeared entirely, fields became blank white plains with no visible boundaries. Livestock struggled. Water froze faster than it could be broken. Feed deliveries fell behind schedule, then stopped altogether. In towns, coal bins began to empty. People burned more fuel than usual because the cold demanded it, but replacement shipments didn't arrive. Families rationed heat instinctively, keeping fires low during the day, gathering in one room at night. Children slept together for warmth. Parents listened to the stove long after everyone else had gone to bed, judging the fire by sound alone. What made this winter different wasn't drama. It wasn't a single night of terror or a sudden wall of destruction. It was the realization that nothing was moving. No storm was passing through. No forecast offered relief. There was no countdown to safety. Just the same cold, tightening its grip, quietly testing how long people could endure before something essential gave way. By the time many Canadians understood that this winter was not like the others, it had already settled in too deeply to escape. And the country was about to learn that surviving cold wasn't just about toughness, it was about time, and how much of it you could afford to wait. At first, people tried to measure it the way they always had, by glancing at thermometers nailed to porch posts or hanging just outside kitchen windows. But very quickly, the numbers stopped helping. The mercury dropped so low that it no longer described discomfort, only danger. This was the kind of cold that erased distinctions between indoors and outdoors, because even inside, warmth became temporary and fragile. Heat rose, escaped, and vanished into the night. Walls radiated chill, floors numbed bare feet in seconds. Breath hung visibly in living rooms long after the fire had been lit, and every movement felt heavier, slower, as if the body itself were resisting the environment it had been placed in. In parts of the prairies, temperatures sank toward levels that made metal brittle and skin unforgiving. Exposed flesh could freeze in moments. Tools snapped, hinges seized. Anything left unattended was punished immediately. What made this cold so destructive wasn't just its intensity, but its persistence. Day after day, the air never warmed enough to reset anything. Snow that might normally compress or melt instead hardened into dense, immovable layers. Ice thickened on every surface, binding doors shut and locking machinery in place. Engines refused to turn over, even when coaxed and cursed at for hours. Oil became sludge. Rubber cracked. Horses, normally reliable in winter conditions, struggled as well, their breath frosting their harnesses, their hooves slipping on ground that had become as hard and slick as glass. Movement itself became a calculated risk because a stumble or a breakdown far from shelter could mean death. As the cold deepened, the country's dependence on its infrastructure was exposed in ways few had ever considered. Railways, designed to run through snowstorms and blizzards, began to fail under the sheer weight of sustained cold. Switches froze solid, steel rails contracted and warped. Snowdrifts hardened faster than crews could clear them, turning tracks into trenches that swallowed plows whole. Trains slowed, then stalled, then stopped entirely. With them went coal deliveries, food shipments, mail, and medicine. Towns that had never thought of themselves as isolated suddenly were, not because they were remote, but because the system connecting them to the rest of the country had quietly shut down. On the farms, the cold turned survival into an hour-by-hour problem. Water troughs froze so fast they had to be broken open multiple times a day. Wells iced over. Wind scoured fields until livestock stood exposed, unable to find shelter from temperatures that drained strength with terrifying efficiency. Stories spread of animals freezing where they stood, bodies locked in place by the cold before they could even fall. Feed, when it existed, was rationed carefully because no one knew when more would arrive. The land itself became unreachable. Snowdrifts erased roads, then fences, then landmarks. A short walk could become disorienting, even fatal, when wind erased tracks and visibility collapsed into white silence. Inside homes, the cold redefined daily life. Families stopped thinking in terms of comfort and began thinking in terms of preservation. Fires were no longer for warmth, but for survival, and every piece of fuel became precious. Coal was burned sparingly. Wood was chopped smaller and stretched longer. Furniture that could no longer be spared was broken apart and fed into stoves. Fence posts disappeared. Old crates, shelving, anything that would burn was pressed into service. The smell of smoke hung permanently in the air, clinging to clothes and hair, a reminder that heat came at a cost and might not last through the night. Food became another daily calculation. Milk froze solid in bottles, bread turned stiff and brittle, meat kept without spoiling, not because of refrigeration, but because the world itself had become a freezer. Cooking took longer, consumed more fuel, and offered less certainty. Meals were simplified, repeated and reduced. Soup pots stayed on stoves as long as fires could be kept going, their contents stretched thin to last another day. Hunger wasn't dramatic, but it was constant, a quiet pressure that sat beside the cold and refused to leave. What unsettled people most was not fear, but uncertainty. There was no sense of progression, no visible edge to the crisis. Each morning brought the same grey light, the same frozen air, the same work required just to maintain the day before. The cold was no longer weather. It was an occupying force, reshaping routines, straining systems, and demanding attention at every moment. And as February wore on, it became clear that this winter was not simply harsher than usual. It was revealing something far more troubling, that even a country built for cold could be brought to a standstill when that cold refused to let go. As the cold dragged on, survival stopped being about reacting and started becoming about planning, minute by minute, decision by decision. Nothing could be done casually anymore. Every action carried consequences that might not be felt until hours later, when the fire burned too low, or a meal ran short, or someone failed to come home on time. Life narrowed. People stopped thinking in weeks or even days. They thought in terms of the next task, the next bit of warmth, the next small problem that had to be solved before it became a dangerous one. Inside most homes, the geography of living shrank to a single room. The fire became the center of existence, not just physically, but emotionally. Chairs were pulled close, meals were eaten there. Children did their schoolwork on knees or crates set near the stove, ink thickening in pens as the air chilled. At night, families slept in layers of clothing, sometimes without undressing at all, because pulling garments back on in the morning meant touching fabric as cold as ice. Bedrooms were used sparingly, kitchens only when necessary. The rest of the house might as well have been outdoors. Fuel dictated everything. People learned to read a fire the way sailors read the sea, adjusting airflow, spacing coal, rationing logs so heat would last through the long nights. When coal ran low, desperation crept in quietly. Furniture that had once represented stability, tables, chairs, cabinets built or bought years earlier, were broken down piece by piece. Fence rails vanished from yards. Old doors were removed and replaced with blankets. Even books were sacrificed, their pages fed to flames despite the knowledge that they could never be replaced. Nothing burned without thought, nothing was wasted without regret. Food followed the same logic. Families counted meals carefully, not because there was nothing to eat, but because there was no guarantee of replenishment. Bread was sliced thinner, stews were watered down, leftovers were never thrown away. Frozen milk was thawed slowly, portioned out, and treated as a luxury. Children learned not to ask for seconds. Adults pretended they weren't hungry. Hunger wasn't loud or dramatic. It was patient, waiting quietly alongside the cold. Outside, movement became a calculated risk. Walking even short distances required planning, extra layers, scarves pulled high, gloves thick enough to insulate but flexible enough to grip. Frostbite stories spread quickly, shared not as warnings but as lessons learned too late. Fingers went numb before pain arrived, ears turned white, noses burned. People learned to cover skin instinctively, to recognize the danger signs before damage was done. Doctors made house calls through snow that reached their waists, medical bags stiff with cold, hands trembling not from fear, but from exhaustion. Children experienced the winter differently, but not easily. Schools closed when buildings became impossible to heat, or roads vanished beneath drifts. For some, this felt like freedom at first. Long days without lessons, a frozen world turned into a place for sledding and games. But even play carried risk. Wet clothes froze solid within minutes. Laughter faded quickly when fingers stopped responding. Parents watched closely, calling children back inside not out of caution, but necessity. Childhood adapted just as everything else did. Mail carriers, railway workers, and delivery men became essential figures in daily life. When they appeared, they were greeted with relief that bordered on gratitude. Letters meant news. Supplies meant survival. When they didn't come, people adjusted without complaint because complaining changed nothing. The winter rewarded patience and punished optimism. Those who assumed tomorrow would be easier often found themselves unprepared. Those who planned for worse tended to last longer. What made this period so draining wasn't any single hardship, but the accumulation of them. Cold, hunger, isolation, fatigue, none overwhelming on their own, but together relentless. There was no drama to mark the passage of time, no clear moment when things got worse. They simply did. And as the weeks passed, Canadians discovered that enduring winter wasn't about strength or toughness. It was about calculation, knowing what you could spare, what you couldn't, and how long you could keep going before something essential ran out. By the time people began to realize how deep the winter had settled in, something else was already happening, quietly and unevenly across the country. The systems that were supposed to hold everything together were no longer reliable, not because they had collapsed all at once, but because they were stretched thin, delayed, and in some places, absent altogether. Help didn't arrive dramatically, with sirens or announcements. It simply didn't arrive when it was needed. And in a winter like this, timing was everything. Canada in 1933 was not equipped for speed. The federal government was already overwhelmed by the Depression, struggling to provide relief to millions who were out of work and barely holding on. Resources were limited, decisions moved slowly, communication lagged. Even when officials understood the severity of conditions in certain regions, there was often little they could do in time. Trains were still the backbone of the country, and when the railways faltered, everything else followed. Coal shipments stalled, food deliveries were delayed indefinitely. Medical supplies piled up hundreds of miles away, unreachable behind frozen lines and impassable drifts. For towns dependent on those systems, the realization was unsettling. There would be no rapid rescue, no organized response sweeping in to restore normal life. The winter had outpaced the country's ability to react. In some communities, telegraph lines went silent, leaving people unsure whether anyone beyond their town even knew what was happening. Isolation became not just physical, but informational. You didn't know when help might come, or if it was coming at all. What filled the gap wasn't policy or planning, it was improvisation. Churches opened their doors and became warming centers, not by directive but by instinct. Schoolhouses turned into shelters where families without fuel could huddle together near a single stove. Farmers shared what feed they could spare, even when it meant risking their own livestock. Neighbors who had barely spoken before knocked on each other's doors to check who still had coal, who had children who hadn't been seen in days. Help moved laterally, not vertically. It flowed between people, not from institutions. Local leaders stepped into roles they hadn't asked for. Postmasters coordinated information. Shopkeepers extended credit they knew might never be repaid. Doctors prioritized visits not based on distance, but on vulnerability, choosing which patients might not survive another night without intervention. In some towns, volunteers organized sled routes to deliver food and fuel where vehicles could not go. Horses, when they could still move, replaced engines. Human strength replaced machinery. What became clear was that survival was no longer a national effort. It was a local one. The broader system had not vanished, but it had receded into the background, too slow and too burdened to be counted on in the moment. Communities were left to bridge the gap themselves, making decisions without guidance, without guarantees, and without the comfort of knowing whether they were doing enough. This wasn't chaos. It was quieter than that. People didn't panic, they adapted, but the adaptation came with a sobering understanding. The modern world they depended on was more fragile than it appeared. Railways, supply chains, relief programs, all of it worked only under certain conditions. And when those conditions were stripped away by a winter that refused to end, what remained was not the system, but the people standing next to you. By midwinter, that truth had settled in as deeply as the cold itself. If anyone was going to get through this, it wouldn't be because help arrived in time. It would be because communities learned how to function without it. As the weeks stretched on, the cold stopped feeling temporary and started to feel permanent. There was no clear point at which people could say the winter had turned a corner. No dramatic shift in the weather. No sudden break in the sky. Each morning arrived looking much like the one before it, grey and unmoving, with air so cold it seemed to hold sound in place. People woke, tended fires, checked supplies, and repeated the same careful routines, not because they expected improvement, but because routine itself had become a form of survival. What wore people down wasn't the intensity of any single day, but the uncertainty of how many more there would be. Without reliable forecasts, there was no sense of an end date. You couldn't count down to relief. You couldn't reassure yourself that help was just days away. Instead, families learned to stop asking when it would end and start asking how long they could last. The question wasn't whether spring would come. It was whether they could endure until it did. Fatigue settled in quietly. Physical exhaustion came first. The constant chopping, hauling, and clearing required just to keep paths open and fires burning. Muscles ached, hands cracked and bled. Sleep was shallow and restless, interrupted by the need to tend stoves in the night or by the cold seeping through layers of blankets. Over time, a deeper weariness followed. The kind that dulled conversation, slowed thought, and made even small decisions feel heavy. People spoke less, conserving energy not just in their bodies, but in their voices. The silence of winter amplified everything. Snow absorbed sound, leaving towns strangely hushed. Without traffic, without trains, without the usual rhythms of movement, days blended together. News traveled slowly, often by word of mouth, and what news there was offered little comfort. Reports of continued cold, of other towns struggling, of delays stretching on. There were no victories to celebrate, only endurance to maintain. When the cold finally began to ease, it did not feel like triumph. It felt tentative, almost suspicious. A slightly warmer afternoon, a drip of water from a roofline, a door that opened a little more easily than it had the day before. People noticed these changes cautiously, unwilling to trust them. Winter had taught them not to assume improvement. Even as temperatures rose, damage emerged. Pipes burst. Animals were found frozen in barns and fields. Crops intended for spring planting were already lost, ruined by months locked in solid ground. The thaw brought work, not relief. Clearing snow revealed broken fences, collapsed roofs, and machinery damaged beyond repair. Roads reappeared slowly, uneven and rutted, requiring weeks of labor to restore. When trains finally ran again, they brought supplies, but also confirmation of loss. What had been consumed, burned, or sacrificed during the winter was gone for good. By the time the season released its grip, people were changed in ways that were hard to articulate. The waiting had stripped life down to essentials and forced a reckoning with limits, personal, communal, and national. This winter had not been survived through bravery or heroics, but through patience, restraint, and the willingness to endure without certainty. And long after the snow melted, that memory lingered, not of how cold it was, but of how long it lasted, and how close everything had come to failing while the country waited for it to end. When the cold finally loosened its hold, there was no moment of celebration, no banners, no speeches, no sense that something historic had just passed. Life resumed gradually, almost awkwardly, as if the country wasn't quite sure how to return to normal. People repaired what they could, replaced what they couldn't, and moved forward without marking the season that had nearly worn them down. And that may be why the winter of 1933 never settled into Canada's national memory the way other disasters did. It didn't arrive in a single night, and it didn't leave behind one defining image. It simply changed things quietly. The damage was spread thin but wide. Farms entered spring already weakened, livestock lost and soil exhausted. Businesses that had closed for weeks never reopened. Families who had burned furniture and tools to stay warm faced months, sometimes years, of rebuilding with little money and less assistance. Health suffered in ways that didn't make headlines. Prolonged cold and malnutrition left lasting effects, especially among the elderly and the very young. People survived, but not unchanged. What did change, slowly and without announcement, was how communities thought about preparedness. The winter exposed the risks of relying entirely on distant systems for survival. Railways were winterized more aggressively in the years that followed. Local fuel storage became a priority in some regions. Emergency planning, still rudimentary by modern standards, began to consider duration, not just intensity. The lesson wasn't about extreme weather. It was about what happens when ordinary life is interrupted for too long. Yet perhaps the most lasting impact wasn't structural, it was cultural. Those who lived through the winter carried its memory quietly, folding it into family stories and personal habits rather than public narratives. Extra fuel kept on hand, food stored away just in case. A tendency to check on neighbors when conditions worsened. These were not policies passed down from government offices. They were instincts, learned the hard way. The winter also reinforced something deeply Canadian, though rarely spoken aloud. Not toughness in the loud, performative sense, but a kind of steady acceptance of hardship paired with mutual responsibility. People didn't frame the season as a victory or a failure. They described it as something that had to be gotten through. The absence of drama was the point. Endurance wasn't celebrated because it wasn't optional. In time, newer events pushed 1933 further into the background. Other winters arrived, other crises demanded attention. And without a single moment to anchor it in textbooks or commemorations, the memory of that season faded from public consciousness. But it never disappeared entirely. It remained in habits, in caution, in the quiet understanding that comfort is conditional, and systems, no matter how dependable they seem, can be overwhelmed. The winter of 1933 didn't leave behind monuments or anniversaries. It left behind people who had learned, without instruction, how fragile normal life could be, and how much depended on preparation, patience, and each other. It's easy to think of winters like this as relics of another time, a harsher era, before modern heating, before accurate forecasts, before the systems we now take for granted. From a distance, 1933 can feel safely contained in history, a story about people who lived differently, endured more, and expected less. But the truth that winter revealed has never gone away. It was never really about cold. It was about how quickly ordinary life can thin out when the margins disappear. What failed in 1933 wasn't courage or effort. People did everything right. They worked harder, rationed carefully, helped one another, and endured without complaint. What failed was the assumption that systems would always be there when needed. Railways that had connected the country for decades stalled. Supply chains that felt permanent became unreliable. Assistance moved too slowly to matter in the moment. None of this happened because of panic or incompetence. It happened because prolonged stress exposed limits that no one wanted to imagine. Modern life is built on similar assumptions. That heat will come on when temperatures drop. That food will appear on shelves. That help will arrive before things become dangerous. Most of the time, those assumptions hold. But history has a way of reminding us that comfort is conditional. It depends on timing, infrastructure, and preparation, and on people showing up when systems can't. The winter of 1933 mattered because it forced a quiet reckoning. It showed that survival is rarely dramatic. It doesn't look like heroism or victory. It looks like sharing fuel, checking on a neighbor, stretching what you have, and accepting that tomorrow might be no easier than today. It looks like patience under pressure and cooperation without instruction. Those who lived through that winter didn't talk about it to make a point. They talked about it because it stayed with them, in the way they prepared, in the way they worried when cold lingered too long, in the way they understood that resilience isn't something you discover when things go wrong. It's something you build long before they do. Canada didn't break in 1933, but it came close enough to learn something important, that what holds a society together isn't strength on paper or systems at scale. It's people quietly adapting, helping, and enduring together when the world slows down and waits to see what will give way first.